Napoleon is quoted as saying, "What is history but a fable agreed upon?" While originally intended to be a cynical observation about the inherent disconnect between the real events of the past and what we consider to be history, in this day and age, I call it wishful thinking.
Much of the history we are taught in schools is wrong.
Tartaria, a location that we are shown on maps that predate our current civilization.
The great empire of Tartaria was a vast country located in northern and central Asia.
Tartaria was in fact a real country.
The entire Tartarian Empire has been erased from the historical narrative.
Secret societies like the Freemasons and the Papal State seized control of our historical timeline, skewing it in their own favor. The evidence, in my opinion, is all around us, hidden in plain sight.
The Tartarian Empire, Great Tartaria, or sometimes just Tartaria, is believed by many to have been a once globe-spanning empire that has since been destroyed, either by natural disasters or intentionally by people, or sometimes a combination of both. Regardless, something all believers in Tartaria usually agree on is that whatever it was, or however it was destroyed, its existence has been deliberately erased from the historical record. Now, besides the idea that Tartaria existed and was subsequently destroyed and covered up, there isn't really one unified Tartaria conspiracy theory. So before I get to the more outlandish beliefs about Tartaria, and trust me, there are some pretty wacky ones out there, I want to go over what the most basic premise of the theory is. The basic version of the Tartarian Empire conspiracy theory seems to have stemmed from a pretty simple misunderstanding. Because unlike with other alternate history theories about advanced civilizations or forgotten empires, Tartaria didn't supposedly exist thousands of years ago. Believers usually posit that the empire fell as recently as the 19th century and that a lot of the evidence for it was covered up in the first half of the 20th century. Also, unlike something like the lost city of Atlantis, we know that Tartaria is a real place. Well, sort of. If you look at European maps of Asia from roughly the 16th century onward up until about the 19th century, you'll see that vast parts of what is today Central Asia, Russia, Mongolia, and China are labeled as Tartaria or Tartary. Tatars are also a real people group. Modern-day Tatars are a Turkic-speaking people that live primarily in Russia, especially in the Republic of Tatarstan, which has a majority Tatar population, as the name might suggest. They're also the second largest ethnic group in Russia after ethnic Russians, and the capital city of Tatarstan, Kazan, is the fifth largest city in Russia. Interesting note about Tatarstan, the Wikipedia page for it does include this picture of Vladimir Putin busting it down at a traditional Tatar festival in the early 2000s. I have absolutely no idea what to do with this information. It has nothing to do with the topic of this video. But I just kind of felt like I should put it out there just in case someone else might know what to do with this information. Now, you might have noticed that I've been referring to Tatars and Tatarstan, both of which are spelled with one R instead of Tartar, which is spelled with two R's. And that is a regional difference. In Western Europe, it was called Tartary because it sounded like the Greek mythological version of hell, Tartarus, which I think is a pretty good insight into how the Western Europeans felt about the Tatars. Now, when I first heard about the alternate history theory of Tartaria, I was vaguely aware that Tatars existed, or at the very least, I knew the source existed. So I thought, okay, I'll go read the Wikipedia page on Tatars and see what they were up to during the time that the Tartarian Empire supposedly existed. Should be pretty straightforward, right? Nowadays, who the ethnonym Tatar, big word, applies to is relatively well defined. But even then, it is important to note modern-day Tatars aren't a single homogeneous group. You have different groups who share the name Tatar, but they came into existence independently of each other. They speak different languages. In Russia, the primary Tatar group are the Volga Tatars, whose history is roughly centered around what is modern-day Tatarstan. But you also have Crimean Tatars, who are native to Crimea. Even though today the population of Crimean Tatars is split between Ukraine and Uzbekistan on account of the mass exile and ethnic cleansing they were subject to when, in typical wholesome Soviet fashion, the Soviet government deported the entire population of Crimean Tatars in the 1940s, sending them mostly to Uzbekistan and in the process killing between 20 to 40% of the entire population. But historically, the definition of Tatar was not nearly as well defined. It kind of just depended on who you were asking, because in Western Europe, the term Tatar applied to pretty much just like anyone from like over here, this general area. Which is why on old European maps, pretty much the entirety of Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, and northern China was called Tartary. It was a name meant to denote a region. The cartographers and the people reading the maps weren't under the impression that it was a single political entity. You can plainly see this just by looking at the maps that supposedly prove the existence of the Tartarian Empire. Like this map from 1700, literally directly under the words Great Tartary, it says, "Here inhabit several hordes of Mongol Tartars under their several princes." I would say that very clearly cuts against the idea that these maps are evidence that people used to know about this great empire that no longer exists and has been covered up in contemporary history. Now, mind you, in Western Europe, people's knowledge of this part of the world was very limited. And if we're being honest, that is still the case. In the sort of Western Anglosphere, most people just don't really know a lot about Central Asia and Russia east of Moscow. We all know that Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire existed, but that's sort of where most people's knowledge on the subject starts and ends. That's why Kazakhstan was chosen for the movie Borat, because Western audiences would have heard of it, but have no idea what it's actually like there. Famously, the village used in the movie wasn't even in Kazakhstan. All of those scenes were actually filmed in Birmingham, England. And as someone whose historical knowledge of this region did consist of watching the movie Borat, when I started looking into Tatar history for this video, I was shocked by just how much information there is. Because usually I feel like it is a lack of information that leaves room for speculation and conspiracy theories. So I went into it sort of assuming that Tatar history would be quite sparse with a lot of unknowns, thus lending itself to conspiracy theories. But there is so much documented history here. Proponents of the Tartaria theory would have you believe that all of this history was made up to cover up the real history of the Tartarian Empire. But if that was the case, the level of world building here would put Tolkien to shame. The fact of the matter is, the underlying mystery that is the bedrock of this conspiracy theory is not a mystery at all. As soon as you look into it, you will find a very simple, very plausible explanation. There is a mountain of historical evidence against the idea of a forgotten Tartarian empire. There is simply so much known about all the different kingdoms and khanates and tribes and who was at war when about what. And the evidence for it is so weak that oftentimes when you're watching a video that's meant to prove it, you don't even need to click off the video to see why the argument being presented holds no water at all.
Now let me just stop here and ask you this. If the Mongols and the Tartars were really nothing more than a horde of barbarians at this point, i.e. the Golden Horde, as we're taught about in American history classes today, then why in the world would they be able to so openly disrespect the papal state like this and get away with it? Why weren't they rounded up and imprisoned during the Catholic Inquisitions just like John Frampton was? It's a legitimate question. With the combined forces of the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, as well as the Moscovians themselves, how could they allow a city like Moscow to be occupied for over 250 years by a mere horde of barbarians? I'll give you a hint, it's because they weren't just a horde of barbarians at all. That part has been whitewashed, clearly. We're taught in today's history books that after the death of Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire began to fall into disarray and descended into the supposed Golden Horde. We're told that this horde consisted of loosely organized tribes of Mongol barbarians who had limited centralized leadership and were essentially savages, roaming marauders who lived in tents and yurts. If this were really true, then I question how could they, of all groups, get away with not only not paying tribute to the papal state, but also levying taxes on its citizenry in Moscow.
Take notes, ladies and gentlemen, because Knockoff Aiden Mattis over here has just given you a great example of a straw man argument. By telling you that modern historians say that for hundreds of years, Moscow was under the control of nothing more than a horde of barbarians and savages, he can then undermine that claim because clearly that can't be the case. These people must have been militarily very powerful if for hundreds of years all the great armies of Europe did not make them submit to Rome. Therefore, this is evidence that the real history of the great Tartarian Empire was whitewashed to make them seem lesser than what they were. Even though the Muscovites were Eastern Orthodox and also didn't submit to Rome, but whatever, we will just ignore that slight oversight in his argument. Besides that, the problem with the point he's trying to make is that I don't think any historians see the Golden Horde as a bunch of naked savages running around the Russian steppe. The narrative he's so unskillfully debunking simply doesn't exist. The Golden Horde was formed after the division of the Mongol Empire. The Mongols were famously known to be militarily quite competent. In fact, I would say that is sort of the main thing they're known for, on account of that whole creating the largest contiguous empire in the history of humanity in less than 100 years thing they had going on. And thankfully for us, this very lovely, kind gentleman included a screenshot of the Wikipedia page about the Golden Horde in his video, that if you pause and read it, talks about how it wasn't until the Golden Horde was weakened by internal conflict that the Muscovites were able to rid themselves of the Tatar yoke, conveniently undermining the entire point he's trying to make without the need to even click off the video. How thoughtful of him. Now, I can go on and on going over more of the supposed historical evidence for the Tartarian Empire. For example, another one that you'll come across a lot in videos about Tartaria are these supposed flags of Tartary that exist in some old flag indexes. The Zilint, that thing on the flag, was the symbol of the Kazan Khanate, which was a Tatar state that existed from 1438 until 1552, and is to this day still very much associated with the city of Kazan. Now, there is apparently some debate on if the Kazan Khanate even had an official flag, but either way, if you were to ask me if it's strange that the symbol of a Tatar state would appear on a flag labeled Tartary, I would say no. Especially at a time where inaccuracies like that about the names and flags of faraway places would be expected. Ultimately, it's not just that there is very little compelling evidence for the existence of the Tartarian Empire, or rather, there is very little evidence and absolutely none of it is compelling. But there is also a mountain of historical evidence about the real history of the region. Now, I have to be honest, even though I learned a lot researching for this video, I am by no means an expert on the history of the Tatar people or this region. So there may very well be differing opinions on the history of this region, like there usually is in most historical discussions. And that's for people who know a lot more than me to discuss. If you're a Mongol nerd, have at it. Knock yourself out. And I mean nerds who are into the Mongolian Empire, not nerds who are from Mongolia, because they might not necessarily be into the Mongolian Empire. They might be into like Pokemon or something, I don't know. But what I can say with absolute confidence is that the evidence for the Tartaria conspiracy theory doesn't come close to challenging the current mainstream understanding of this history. Especially since I haven't been fully honest with you. The way I've presented the conspiracy theory hasn't been inaccurate per se. However, I have failed to mention a pretty major part of it. Up until this point, what I have presented has been the most bare-bones defensible version of the theory, which is just the idea that the Tartarian Empire existed at all, and that there was a deliberate effort to change or hide its history. Now, there are two reasons why I wanted to do it like this. Firstly, because there are actually some people for whom that is more or less the extent of what they believe, but they certainly are in the minority of Tartaria truthers. Secondly, as weak as the theory I've talked about so far is, the rest of the beliefs around Tartaria are still somehow leagues dumber. It's honestly shocking. As I've mentioned before, the Tartaria theory varies a lot depending on who you ask, but it does have two sort of main components that form the basis of this theory for most people. One is the maps that I've already talked about, but the other is architecture. The idea is that a lot of the buildings we see now that were supposedly built 100, 200 years ago are in reality much older. They were built by the Tartarians, or the Old World civilization. They also believe that many of these Old World buildings have been destroyed as a part of the cover-up that has happened. Easily the most popular example of this that gets brought up are the buildings that were built for and shortly demolished after the World Fairs at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. Especially the 1893 World Columbian Exposition, the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition, and the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition. Now this is something that people do wonder about. You see pictures of these huge, magnificent buildings, and you can't help but wonder why they would be torn down again so quickly. A very reasonable question. I think that would be anyone's first thought. But it turns out there is a very reasonable answer. These buildings were always meant to be torn down. They were essentially wooden or sometimes iron frames covered in a molded plaster facade. It couldn't last. In fact, the plaster would deteriorate to the point where repairs had to be made while the exhibition was still ongoing. Now, believers in Tartaria posit a ever so slightly different theory. They believe that these buildings were not purpose-built for these fairs. They were already hundreds of years old. They're from the Old World, from Tartaria, and they were already there when Europeans arrived in the Americas. And they weren't built for the World Fairs, but rather the World Fairs were held to create a cover story for their destruction. Now, what evidence do we have of this? Well, two things really. One is that they say they could not have been built in the time that they were supposedly built in. And the other piece of evidence is that they clearly could not have been temporary buildings, because they don't look like temporary buildings. I'm not joking.
So what was the official explanation? That they were temporary structures built with plaster and wooden frames. But when you look at the photographs, do such buildings look temporary?
Now listen, I agree. If you look at the photographs from the fairs, the buildings do not look temporary. However, if you look at the many photographs that exist of them under construction, you can see that they are very clearly just frame structures covered in plaster, and were obviously not already there for hundreds of years. Now, putting that aside, if we just ignore for a second the part where there is quite literally no evidence for it, and assume that these buildings are from a lost empire, you might be asking the question, what does that have to do with Tartaria? Because on the surface, those two things seem completely unrelated to each other. What reason is there to believe that an empire in Eastern Europe and Asia built buildings in St. Louis, Missouri, of all places? Well, I'll be honest, I have no idea. I could not tell you. That particular detail just gets completely glossed over. There's literally nothing for me to even try to debunk here. They will talk about the maps and how they prove Tartaria was real, and then they will talk about the buildings in North America as further evidence of Tartaria being real, with no real attempt made to prove how those two things are related. The closest they ever get is that they will argue that all around the world you find buildings that look similar.
It was in fact a nation and not simply an area of land, and there's every indication that it had also spread out to become a worldwide civilization. This is very much suggested by the similar architecture in so many countries around the world, very old architecture, which is all very much the same. And this is what is termed Greco-Roman architecture. But one would ask, why would every country around the world be building their government buildings using the same architecture? You find this everywhere. You find it all through the Americas, you find it through South America, you find it even in Japan and Australia. So why would they be using the same style? That's the question.
Honestly, I'm gonna have to take back what I said. Because this guy makes such a great point. It's only logical that there would have been some sort of massive, great empire that existed for like 1,000 years that would have been massively influential on all of human history, that would be the source of Greco-Roman architecture. That would make a lot of sense. Doesn't really ring a bell though, to be honest. You know, like I'm trying to think of something, but nothing really comes to mind that would fit that description. So yeah, I suppose it must have been Tartaria. Another pretty obvious inconsistency with the architectural argument, to me at least, is around the destruction narrative, because so often they will frame events in history that cause the destruction of buildings, like citywide fires, as a deliberate attempt to destroy the old world. But sometimes it's not even real disasters. A very popular theory as to how Tartaria met its end is mud floods. And usually these mud floods are framed as being man-made, a part of their effort to destroy and hide Tartaria, whoever they are supposed to be, the Freemasons or the Jews or the Vatican, or it can really be whoever you want them to be. The supposed evidence for mud floods is that many buildings seem to have had their lower floors submerged underground. And having seen many, if not most, of the pictures that gets used as evidence for this, I can tell you it is usually one of four things. The street level was actually raised, either slowly over time or sometimes deliberately. The building is just built on a slope. Excavations happen next to a building, and what you're seeing is just the foundation. Or sometimes what they point to are literally just basement windows. And then of course there is the aforementioned deliberate demolition of buildings like the World Fairs. But then in the same videos where they will stress how they went to great lengths to destroy the old world, the conspiracy theorists will point to still perfectly intact buildings as also being evidence of the old world, and how there are still old world buildings all around us. But of course, their history has been totally fabricated, and they're really much older than we are told. Now, to me, the idea that these supposed rewriters of history would in some cases go so far as to burn down entire cities or somehow conjure up mud floods to wipe out evidence of the old world, albeit quite badly considering most of the evidence for mud floods are buildings that are still standing, but in other cases, leave buildings completely intact, doesn't really check out. It seems to me that it should be pretty obvious to anyone that the broader belief in the old world Tartaria conspiracy theory is just a patchwork of theories thrown together with very little regard for logical consistency or anything resembling it. There is not a circle these people could not square. Yet when you look at the videos promoting these ideas, they have tens to hundreds of thousands of views and comment sections filled with people who believe this stuff. And that always baffles me. Although in reality, I suppose there is a pretty obvious explanation for that, and I hate to say it like this, but I am a Tartaria truther, so I have to tell the truth. The people who believe this are idiots. They're dumb. That sounds mean to say, but they have to be. I can't think of any other explanation. Well, I mean, maybe, I'm sure there are other contributing factors, reasons people might be predisposed to falling into these kinds of beliefs. Unfortunately, none of those reasons are going to discount the fact that you do need to be stupid to believe in Tartaria. I just don't think there's any getting around that. But it's not just that. These people genuinely seem brainwashed. But ironically, unlike the theories about the world they believe in, there is no grand conspiracy. There is no global cabal of Jews or Freemasons or whatever villain you choose to have, pulling the strings, manipulating institutions, altering the historical record to coerce these people into believing a completely fabricated version of history. They've brainwashed themselves, the product of being a gullible idiot and not knowing it. I think it can be quite a dangerous thing to think of yourself as a free thinker who questions everything, when in reality that couldn't be further from the truth. They insulate themselves in a made-up fantasy world where they get to enjoy the superiority complex that comes with believing you are one of the enlightened few, smugly referencing 1984 and misquoting Napoleon, as if throwing around these phrases gives credibility to their theories that, if true, would mean a cover-up of history on a scale that not even a North Korean dictator could imagine in his wildest dreams. There is no way to describe these beliefs other than a complete and utter detachment from reality. But they don't see it like that. They think that if you just stop believing what you are told by schools and the media and started doing your own research, you would begin to unravel the lies you've been told. But ironically, if they started doing their own research, they would see that the people spreading these conspiracy theories are outright lying to them. And you don't need a degree to do this. You don't need to rely on the testimony of some expert. If you can read and comprehend the English language, you've got everything you need. And the best example I have of this is the declassified CIA document. If you look into the Tartaria theory at all, it is only a matter of time before someone will bring up this document as proof of the cover-up of Tartaria.
But there's also a CIA document that was declassified in 1999 stating that all about the suppression of Tartaria, why it was removed, why they didn't want anybody talking about it, and a lot of that happens to be connected to the fact that they wanted Russia, which was one of the key parts of the empire, to appear backward, that they were technologically backward in comparison to the Western world. And the CIA actually have this document online. You can get it on their archives, showing you in black and white why they did it. And it actually has one sentence in it that says, mate, you know, in no uncertain terms, we are stating here that Tartaria and all evidence of it is to be completely removed.
Okay, just so we're all on the same page. According to what you just heard, there supposedly exists a CIA document that states why Tartaria was removed and that they don't want anyone talking about it. Because they, presumably American intelligence in this context, considering he is talking about the CIA and didn't mention anyone else, because they wanted the Russians to appear technologically backwards. And then again, he says the CIA has this document on their website that says why they did it. Again, just so we're all on the same page here, he is talking about the CIA, why they erased Tartaria, that they state in no uncertain terms, in black and white, that all evidence of Tartaria had to be removed. Now, if you think about that for a minute, doesn't it seem strange that the CIA would declassify a document in which they admit to something as severe as outright falsifying history and erasing the evidence of a large technologically advanced empire? I mean, I'm no expert in rewriting history, but I don't think you're supposed to tell people when you've rewritten history. That's 1984 101. Well, I'll tell you, he is absolutely correct. This file 100% does exist. I would know because I have it right here. It is from June 1957, and it is titled National Cultural Development Under Communism, and it is up on the CIA's website right now for anyone to read or print out. And like I said before, if you ever look into the Tartaria conspiracy theory, you are bound to run into someone referencing this document. In fact, when I came across that video of that guy talking about it, I had already read the document. So let me read to you what it says about Tartaria. Or let us take the matter of history, which along with religion, language, and literature constitute the core of a people's cultural heritage. Here again, the communists have interfered in a shameless manner. For example, on 9 August 1944, the Central Committee of the Communist Party, sitting in Moscow, issued a directive ordering the party's Tartar Provincial Committee to proceed to a scientific revision of the history of Tartaria, to liquidate serious shortcomings and mistakes of a nationalistic character committed by individual writers and historians in dealing with Tartar history. In other words, Tartar history was to be rewritten, let us be frank, was to be falsified, in order to eliminate references to great Russian aggressions and to hide the facts of the real course of Tartar-Russian relations. And this was no isolated case. In every Muslim area within the USSR, historians, on orders of the Communist Party, have rewritten history to distort the facts so that Russians appear always in a good light. Needless to say, histories which present the facts truthfully have been withdrawn and destroyed, so that the present and future generations of Muslims are forever denied the chance of learning the true facts of their nation's past. That is it! Out of this entire 14-page document, the only other mentions of Tartars is in reference to the genocide of the Crimean Tartars, and where the document starts off by quoting a statement made by the Bolsheviks in 1917, where they address, among other Muslims, the Tartars of the Volga and Crimea, saying, "Muslims of Russia, Tartars of the Volga and Crimea, and all you whose mosques and prayer houses have been destroyed, whose beliefs and customs have been trampled upon by the czars and the oppressors of Russia. Henceforth, your beliefs and customs, your national and cultural institutions are forever free and inviolate. Organize your national life in complete freedom. This is your right." Of course, the communist idea of letting people organize their life in complete freedom is by committing a cultural genocide against them. But, you know, No ideology is perfect. And that is what this document is about. It is a report about how the Soviet government oppressed religious and ethnic minorities, specifically Muslims, in the Soviet Union. The document says absolutely nothing about actions by the CIA. In fact, the document is actually quite sympathetic to all these minority groups. And that's not exactly surprising. It might seem somewhat surprising in a post-9/11 world, but this was the CIA in the 50s. Obviously, they're going to be sympathetic to victims of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union was their #1 enemy at that time. Even if you take the part I read out of context, it still does not say what that guy said it does. And if you were to do what he said and actually read the whole thing, it becomes blatantly obvious that he was lying. He must be. Either he is lying or he has never actually read the document. And it would be very irresponsible as someone who would like to be taken even somewhat seriously to cite a document and emphasize how easily accessible it is if you've never read it. And I don't think it's the latter. I think he has read it, and I think he's blatantly lying about what it says. There's a surprising amount of content about Tartaria available on YouTube, and I want to be clear, I don't think everyone who makes content about Tartaria is purposefully lying. I think a lot of them have themselves lost their grip on reality and genuinely believe everything they say. Unfortunately though, none of the people who make content about the Tartaria conspiracy theory are particularly good at making content. There are really two main types of videos you'll come across. One is just pure AI slop. Entire channels dedicated to making videos about Tartaria where the entire thing from the script to the visuals to the voiceover is just AI generated. It's really bad. The second is also really bad, but it has that distinct human quality of a guy who thinks he's way smarter than he really is, with a shitty microphone talking over a slideshow of low resolution images. And I'll take that over AI slop any day of the week. There are entire channels like that dedicated to Tartaria, the old world, and the many other aspects to this conspiracy that I just won't be going in depth on in this video. There really is just so much stuff about this conspiracy that I could talk about, like how the whole thing seems to have its roots in books written by a Russian professor called Anatoly Fomenko, who proposed something called new chronology, which is basically the idea that large parts of history was fabricated to essentially make history longer. Basically, a lot of things that we think happened in the ancient world really happened much more recently. Now that is a whole other rabbit hole that I did not dive into too deeply, but apparently this idea was promoted by chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov for some reason. Although I suppose you can't really blame him because Anatoly Fomenko is an award-winning author. At the 2004 Moscow International Book Fair, Fomenko was given the award for worst book published in Russia. So, you know, this is all built on solid foundations. Now there is still a lot more to the beliefs about Tartaria, like that they had airships or that they were giants, and you know, you'll occasionally find some flat earth or hollow earth sprinkled in there as well. There's also a lot of stuff about like resonance frequencies, 432 hertz, that kind of thing.
High spirits, dude. Key of G minor, 432 hertz. See it on the insignia. Rainbow Moonstone.
Why are you doing this to me?
What are you doing to what?
You know you're doing this to me.
There's even this one guy I found who was basically saying the Tartarians were Aryans and that Genghis Khan was white.
It appears on ancient maps, had worldwide influence, and once was ruled by an Aryan nobility. Here we see a modern interpretation of Genghis Khan, yet in reality, Genghis Khan had red hair and either green or blue eyes.
Which I will say, you know, speaking on behalf of the white race over here, do we really have to claim Genghis Khan? You know, like, he wasn't a great guy. He kind of did a lot of raping. Is it really necessary for us to be out here like, stop lying about Genghis Khan? He was one of us! One of us! One of us! One of... I'm good, you know? I just think I'm gonna sit this one out. I wouldn't describe myself as a big race revisionism guy. But I definitely don't think this is where I'm gonna get started with it. You know, I think the Mongolians can keep him. You know, they've got a big statue of him. They seem pretty happy with that. So, you know what? Good for them. They can keep him. I don't think we need him. Anyway, I don't think going into all of the related beliefs around Tartaria is really that important for the purposes of this video. And also, if I'm being honest, I think doing so would cost me my sanity. For example, one of the reasons given for why Tartaria had to be destroyed was that the domes and spires on top of churches was really used to harness free energy from the ether, and that's why Tartaria had to be destroyed, so we could all be forced to pay for energy. Like, what am I even supposed to say about that? What am I even supposed to say about that? Now, in all fairness, I do think sometimes these conspiracy theories do try to answer legitimate questions about the world. Like I said about the world fairs, you see pictures of these grand palaces that existed 100 years ago, and your immediate question is, what happened to them? Why were they destroyed? Or, why are modern buildings so much uglier than old buildings? A great question, and I actually feel quite strongly about this, because I hate ugly architecture. I think ugly buildings are an affront to all things good and holy. And for thousands of years, humanity has been building beautiful buildings. And sometimes we still do, not every modern building is ugly, but despite this being a solved problem, so many buildings built in the post-war era are just really ugly. And ugly buildings make ugly cities, and ugly cities make me want to shoot myself. Now, why is this? Why is so much of modern architecture ugly? Well, I don't know, to be honest. Is it just that boomers are retarded? Maybe. But if I was talking to someone, and I said everything I just said, and they went, oh, actually, I know why modern buildings are ugly. It's because the old world buildings used sacred geometry and resonance frequencies to create vibrations that created centers of healing, as well as harnessing the power of the ether to produce free wirelessly transmitted energy. But a secret order of elites caused mud floods to destroy the old world so they can make us pay for electricity and healthcare. I would say, okay, so it's definitely not that. Whatever the reason is, I know for certain it is not that, and you are clearly a crazy person. And I'm quite certain that most people would agree with me, but these people still believe it. It's really quite sad, actually, because you will come across these comments where people are expressing how sad they feel that all of this history was lost, that it was taken from them. And there's something quite tragic to me about someone feeling this sense of loss over something that just never existed. And it's very strange to me how people end up at that point where they're so bought in that they feel this genuine sense of sorrow over something that to everyone else is just obviously made up. I think it might just be a skill issue, a critical thinking skill issue. Now, why do some people seem so prone to a lack of critical thinking skills? I don't know. I think that is a question many people would like answered, but it is way beyond my pay grade. And I think if you combine that with a severe distrust in the authorities, you end up with conspiracy theories like this. And to be clear, I don't think questioning the quote-unquote mainstream narrative is an inherently bad thing. In fact, I think it is quite an important thing, because if no one ever questions the mainstream understanding of something, then knowledge will never progress. But the flip side of that is, oftentimes someone will question the mainstream understanding of something, and they'll be wrong. The act of questioning a narrative, mainstream or otherwise, isn't inherently good or bad. Truth is good, and falsehoods are bad, and I think we should generally strive to believe things that are true. Obviously, there are many things that affect what we believe. We view everything through the lens of our own environment and experiences. And no one's ever going to actually get it right to only believe things that are true, and there are cases where two rational, informed people can hold opposing beliefs about something. But I think it's still worth it to strive for objective truth, or as close to it, in cases where objective truth does exist. Now, I don't know if someone who believes in Tartaria could actually have their mind changed. Like the saying goes, you can't reason someone out of a belief they didn't reason themselves into. And if you could, then I don't think this video is what would do it either. That just wasn't really my intention. But I hope you found this video entertaining or informative, because that is what it was intended to do. I certainly found it informative to make. So if you liked the video, leave a like. If you didn't, leave a long angry comment telling me why. Bye. Epic.